Hello class. Today's presentation will be for my LIB495 capstone, the Advanced Research Project. The subject I've chosen to explore is called Woman in Total Control of Herself, Deconstructing the Witch Archetype as a Social Scapegoat and a Feminist Icon. To begin, Barksdale explains the witch is a figure who is both marginal and marginalized. She is a non-normative threat to the social order. In order to broach the subject of the portrayal of women as witches in the humanities, it is necessary for us to first establish the research question at hand in the form of a thesis statement, and for me to provide a bit of background on why this is a worthy subject. By exploring the different ways that the witch image in history, art, and literature has been crafted by a patriarchal society, how witches or women have been persecuted throughout history, and how modern culture has translated the archetype of the witch in music, pop culture, politics, etc., I will examine the archetype as a vehicle for both the erasure of female autonomy and as a source for empowerment for the modern woman. Why then is this an important topic worthy of our time and exploration? Well, to begin, the portrayal of women in the humanities has vastly shaped how society views their power, potential, and purpose within the existing social systems, most of which were set up for the benefit of men. Gender roles have been cemented by this witch archetype, a historically negative portrayal of women that impacts female autonomy and reaffirms both the cultural and political ramifications of these socially contrived identities. Ultimately, by understanding the history of the witch archetype as a scapegoat for gender discrimination and gendercide, it allows us to reflect on the gender-based violence against women while understanding how women can reclaim the archetype for their own purposes and move forward. There are a couple questions we might consider while exploring the witch archetype in the humanities, whether that be from art, classic and contemporary literature like Homer's The Odyssey and Shakespeare's Macbeth, or more modern literature like Alice Hoffman's Practical Magic or George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones series, film as in The Wizard of Oz, Hocus Pocus, The Craft, etc., television, art, global politics, and so on. These questions are: 1, what does the image of the witch, both throughout history and in contemporary media, say about women? And more importantly, number 2, what does the archetype say about society? Here I'll spend some time reviewing the existing scholarship. The current academic context really does explore the cultural figure of the witch and how it has come as a result of patriarchal ego and the societal fear that women have been deemed difficult. The idea of the witch archetype is closely related to Carl Jung's philosophical archetypes, which will be discussed later in this presentation at length. Most research has in common, it seems, the idea that the image of the witch, at least in the Western psyche, is made of gender offenders who have been punished for their refusal to submit to societal norms, be these domesticity, motherhood, religious affiliation, etc. The recurring themes of female oppression via the negative witch archetype, the violent methods by which women have been persecuted for this perceived identity, and the idea that popular culture has adopted an affinity for portraying women as witches despite the historical ramifications of the archetype, are present in the robust majority of the academic sources cited both in this work and in my longer research paper to follow. What is an archetype? To fully understand the witch archetype and its ramifications, we must first think about what exactly an archetype in essence is. Carl Jung, the founder of analytical psychology, is responsible for immortalizing the concept of archetypes. He defined his archetypes as a kind of readiness to reproduce over and over again the same mythical ideas. Of this, he said, they are the ruling powers, the gods, images of the dominant laws and principles, and of typical, regularly occurring events in the soul's cycle of experience. Jung's archetypes are models based on social patterns that comprise images used to understand how the psyche influences human behavior. There were 12 original Jungian archetypes, including the ruler, the creator or the artist, the sage, the innocent, the explorer, the rebel, the hero, the magician or wizard, the jester, the everyman, the lover, and the caregiver. These archetypes didn't historically include the witch, which is the archetype that this research project focuses on. However, her image really can be considered an amalgamation of elements from other Jungian archetypes. Ultimately, the witch archetype mirrors the social attitudes towards women and the application of that image in the humanities hints at their treatment in society. Defining the witch archetype. Now that we understand what an archetype is in its most basic form, we can better explore the witch archetype and how it came to be. The witch archetype and those it seeks to describe embodies society's fears of female autonomy. Consequences of the portrayal of women as witches result from a chaotic portrayal of powerful, informed, and autonomous women in literature, music, art, popular culture, contemporary film, politics, etc. The image of the witch in art, politics, literature threatens and destabilizes the systems of social order, patriarchy, religion, and capitalism, according to Barksdale. By understanding the history of the archetype is based in both prolific sexist human mythology and biblical representations of women, and on the European witch craze, wherein accusations against mostly innocent European people, especially women, and the development of a theological system in which witchcraft became a central phenomenon from the 14th or 17th centuries, and the Salem witch trials, where women who were suspected of performing nefarious deeds on behalf of Satan and even possession by the devil, were systematically persecuted and often killed in colonial Massachusetts between February 1692 and May 1693, is essential to conceptualizing the archetype as a whole. So all of this history and background really is important for understanding how the witch archetype came to be. The witch archetype is often presented as being dual-natured, or having a duality, with the crone image on one hand and the temptress witch on the other. On the one hand, similar to the left-hand side photo, the witch is portrayed as an old hag. This is also known as the crone. This iteration of the witch archetype is haggard, frightening, and well past her prime. She represents society's fears about aging, the wisdom that comes from being old, and the waning fertility of women and what this means for their usefulness. The crone also illustrates the impossible beauty standards thrust upon women via oppressive gender norms that require youth and vitality. The crone version of the witch archetype is depicted with green skin, as we find with the Wicked Witch of the West from The Wizard of Oz. She often has a warty nose, fragile and crooked bones, and she's conventionally unattractive. This mirrors her evil, ugly inner being. Examples of the crone are the three witches known as the Wayward Sisters from William Shakespeare's Macbeth, the child-eating Baba Yaga, Hansel and Gretel's antagonist witch, and the Sanderson sisters from 1993's Hocus Pocus. These three sisters, much like in Macbeth, whose goal is to literally suck the youth and beauty from the children of Salem, Massachusetts. If this isn't a personification of the crone, I don't know what else is. On the other hand, as we see in the right-hand image, the witch archetype can also cast women as vixens with loose morals, sexual promiscuity, and an understanding of their power that threatens the systems of man. These are temptress witches. This iteration of the witch archetype acts as a stern warning to the woman with agency. It promises consequences if she strays outside of the boundaries of acceptable female behavior, whether this be motherhood, wifehood, subservience, etc. This vixen witch image speaks to society's distaste for female sensuality, a power, and it casts her as a selfish and capable of causing great mayhem. Examples of the witch in this form, the temptress witch form, from across the humanities include the Hindu Kali, Greek Medusa, Homer's Circe from Odyssey, the Melisandre or Red Witch character from the aforementioned George R. R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire, which is the Game of Thrones television series, and the teenage coven of witches from the popular The Craft film, as in this image, who use their adolescent sexuality to lure a misogynistic high school rapist to his death. Both of these characterizations, although they're very different, represent patriarchal fear of the feminine and a foreboding threat to the symbolic order of things. The duality of this image, or of these images, both old and young, ugly and beautiful, repulsive and seductive, echo the duality of womanhood itself. something that threatens the patriarchy and threatens man and threatens men's systems. The witch is at once female divinity, female ferocity, and female transgression. She is all and she is one. Kristen Sully. This section of my presentation will discuss the witch hysteria and the witch trials. We will explore the European witch hysteria and the Salem witch trials of colonial America. These instances of gendercide, or the systematic killing of members of a specific gender, in this case women, came as a direct result of the portrayal of women as witches in history, society, and the humanities. Cunning women, as they were depicted in the humanities, were not witches at all. Instead, they were women who dared subvert the social ideas of the time. These quote-unquote witches were merely women who had knowledge about the human body. They were midwives. They were also adulteresses or deemed fornicators in religiously pious societies that frowned upon sexual agency. They were either too rich or too poor, too young or too old, had too much bodily autonomy, had too much land. Most importantly, these women, threatened the male-dominated status quo. Between the 14th and 18th centuries, the European witch craze, also referred to as witch hysteria, and the Salem witch trials of colonial America saw thousands of women accused, tortured, sexually abused, burned at the stake, and executed for their supposed ties to witchcraft, and for personifying the public image of the witch that we see in the Archetype. It's worth noting that 400 years of European and North American witch panic were not all based on misogyny and sexism, but also had class struggles, ableism, racism, purity culture, and political unrest to blame for the decimation of women deemed to exist on the outskirts of society. Although the European witch craze and the New England witch trials were not solely acts of gendercide, at the root of the witch hunts were misogynistic issues with female autonomy, opposition to the moral rights of women to govern their own bodies and make their own decisions, and Puritan views of female sexuality. Here we explore the European witch craze in numbers. In 2017, Leeson and Russ did a study wherein they contended that more than 35,000 people were prosecuted for witchcraft during this period of hysteria, and in no fewer than 10,000 separate trials, with more than 16,000 of these trials ending in death. Although some of these accused were men, roughly 80% of those burned at the stake for witchcraft were women, and the males who were accused either represent those with significant connections to a woman thought to be a witch, or men who directly threaten the patriarchal social systems in question. This means that ultimately the European witch craze and the Salem witch trials were indeed acts of violence against women. While poor record-keeping in the late medieval and early modern times present an enigma in which exact figures are unknown, another estimate is that nearly 1 million women were charged with witchcraft, and 50% of them were executed. Here we see a graph about the death toll of Europe's witch trials, with the most staggering number of deaths happening in Germany. Shortly following, Switzerland, France, Scotland, and Spain all had significant numbers of both trials and trials that resulted in executions. This portion of the presentation will focus on women as witches within the humanities and their depiction therein. Literature. Examples of the witch archetype in literature include Eve from the Judeo-Christian Bible. While she may not be a witch in the traditional sense, the connection between the Christian character of Eve and the archetype of the witch that communicates a seductive woman intent on leading man astray from his path of righteousness is truly significant. Eve's relationship to the witch archetype persisted through the period of Puritan witch hysteria in the late 1600s per the belief that Goodbeer explained as female bodies as the weaker sex and descendants of Eve were most vulnerable to the devil's influence. So in the Bible, we see Eve cast as a witch in so saying, she's not really a witch in the Bible, but she's seen as a witch because she leads Adam astray. She's in direct communication with the devil, and this really does set up the archetype for later appearances in literature and the rest of the humanities. Alongside Eve, Circe and Medea create a cultural context for their respective societies, and these three literary women provide a basis for the forthcoming witch phenomenon. In Euripides' Medea, we are explicitly told why this sorceress, also known as a witch, also known as a woman if we really boil it down, be her unable or unwilling to obey her husband Jason, is undeserving of love or safety. Here we see the witch cast as something, socially undeserving. Shakespeare's wayward sisters firmly cement the old hag or crone version of the witch. And the witch archetype forms reductive literary tropes meant to pit jealous, aging women, read witches, against young, beautiful, and guileless maidens, as in the Brothers Grimm's Snow White and Sleeping Beauty. L. Frank Baum's Glinda the Good Witch was inspired by Matilda Jocelyn Gage's revolutionary attempt to use the witch archetype as a symbol for female power. While this was not well received, she did inspire her son-in-law to pen the first true good witch in literary history, Glinda the Good Witch. Contemporary characters like the Owens women from Alice Hoffman's novel Practical Magic and John Updike's Witches of Eastwick have furthered this subversion of the archetype and conveyed even more positive depictions of women as witches in literature, which essentially turns this archetype on its head in modern times. Here we'll focus on art. In the time of Kramer's Malleus Maleficarium that influenced the Salem witch trials and the European witch hunts. Relatively, this was published in 1486. It is notable that most Europeans or early American Puritans were illiterate. Therefore, visual art really has historically acted as the catalyst for the witch archetype, appropriating ideas about the witch and distributing them across society. In this image, we see two Waldensian witches from Le Champion des Dents, the first depiction of broomstick-riding witches in art. Lyndall Roper, a surrealist and historian whose research centers on gender and the Reformation, witchcraft, and visual culture, explains the figure of the witch took hold of Western European imagination because she could express terror that laid beyond words, reaching into deep ambivalence about death, identity, and motherhood. She offered a resource for the imagination. A few examples of the witch in art. You'll have to excuse me, I didn't realize that this first example didn't attach to my presentation. Albrecht Dürer's The Witch, circa 1500, depicted the witch as a fearsome and menacing figure without clothing, with a muscular build, and winged boys worshipping at her feet. Images, engravings, and illustrations like this one circulated throughout the 15th through 17th centuries, damning women and creating the prolific witch image that we come to think of today. The second image here in the middle is Franz Franken II's The Witch's Sabbath from 1607. It features a wide range of women, a mixture of the poor and extravagantly dressed, the old and the young, some enraptured with devilish creatures, some hard at work on their witchcraft, and it calls upon traditional witch themes to convey the duality of the archetype. There's a nighttime setting in this painting, and the chaotic nature of all of the subjects allude to illicit activities that are occurring therein. Cohen, in 2019, asserted that with a group of women, a coven, perhaps crowded around a book, here you can see them at the table and kneeling to the side of the table on the right, the message from Franken is truly clear. The message would be, beware a group of literate and independent women. In the third example, to the far right, Varro's To Be Reborn from 1960, and similar depictions like this one begins to see a shift in which the witch archetype includes the perspectives of women. It is a fundamental reframing of the archetype meant to subvert its sordid history, just as Glinda the Good Witch did for literature. Moving away from paintings and into visual art in the form of contemporary film and television, we see one of many places where the witch archetype has been significantly overhauled. A few examples of witches in film and television. On the far left, we see Bewitched from 1964. And Bewitched truly is a notable positive portrayal of women as witches in the humanities. The black and white era sitcom uses a narrative about 1960s witch turned American housewife, Samantha, to conflate revolutionary social ideas about ethnic segregation and racial disparity, and the plight of domestically oppressed housewives in the 1960s. In the center, we see a poster for Charmed, which ran from 1998 to 2006. And this program really used a sex cells approach to take a long look at the archetype that has so profoundly impacted women. This program did a lot for the empowerment of women, but it also played into the male gaze. Most recently, on the far right, we see a poster for The Craft Legacy from 2020. This uses a female writer and director, Zoe Lister-Jones, and a cast made up of predominantly women and trans women, and also woke dialogue to make a progressively intersectional feminist statement about the witch archetype in modern times. Moving on to politics, the witch archetype as a vehicle for vilifying powerful women is far from new. As far back as Joan of Arc's French Crusade, women have been tried for witchcraft for their refusal to submit to normative ideas about gender. As women transcended gender restrictions and braved the political machine, the patriarchy continued to use the witch archetype to defame and undermine their prowess. A couple of examples of political witch hunts. From the damning representation of suffragist and presidential candidate Victoria Woodhull on the left as being in cahoots with the devil, to the character assassination of 2016 presidential candidate and internet-dubbed Wicked Witch of the Left, Hillary Clinton, on the right, women as witches and women as wicked have been a predominant feature in politics. Like the Puritans of the past, modern misogynists condemn women as witches to maintain control of the power dynamic. By vilifying these women in these ways and tearing down their character on the internet and in literature and in the newspaper and syndicate news, they're defaming character of women by use of the witch archetype. Moving forward to subverting the archetype or reclaiming it for female empowerment. Be it literature, art, film, television, or politics, it is clear that the image of the witch has historically been used to systematically put women in their place. As the archetype evolves in tandem with modern social evolution, there is hope that subversion of the witch icon can lead to increased female empowerment. Subversion of a culturally internalized witch stereotype, a process that Erica Feldman refers to as how to leverage the witch archetype for radical feminist purposes, allows women who have historically been depreciated via a viral cultural ideology to reclaim the witch icon as something empowering. Witches are arguably some of the most abiding feminist symbols to come out of the humanities, and we have seen a resurgence of self-identifying witches and the harnessing of the witch archetype as a political or social statement about the power of women. From television to film, music to fashion, literature to art, and beyond, modern depictions of the witch can be found conquering our contemporary culture. Congruent with the latest wave of feminism, also referred to as either fourth wave, late third wave, or intersectional feminism, it is no coincidence that witches are experiencing a cultural renaissance. One more quote from Kristen Soley to finish us out. Throughout history, the figure of the witch has both challenged and reflected patriarchal narratives about female power, making her one of the most enduring feminist icons of all time. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I look forward to hearing your feedback.